Well, hello there, Alpha Males, and welcome to Alpha Male Podcast, the podcast where we talk about what it means to be a man the right way, with God at the center, made in His image, strong, dominant, and in control. And we don't apologize for that. Working title, but often overlooked or underappreciated areas in survival, preparedness, whatever you want to call that kind of genre. I'm a prepper, I'm a survivalist. I don't apologize for that. You've probably heard my bio in many other episodes. I'm not going to rehash that now. But we often gravitate, and you know that I like the tactical stuff. I've been a professional gunfighter most of my adult life. Again, if you've heard the bio, I like guns. I like ARs. I like competition shooting. I like all that stuff. But if we look soberly, if we take a, sobering look, instead of what's fanciful, what's cool on a prepper movie or a prepper novel, of all the tactical, battle tomahawks and the coolest AR with the coolest accessories. And again, I like that stuff. But if we look soberly at the actual main killers throughout history, throughout time, throughout warfare, throughout major disasters, it's generally not a bullet or a blade, although they kill many, and you should be prepared in that way. Oftentimes, the biggest killers are much more insidious, is a good word, I think, for that. They're very insidious. And do we prep for those things, or do we kind of push them aside because they're not tactical, because they're not flashy? Because, let's face it, as men, they're not as fun to prep for as, buying lots of guns and ammo. Again, which I like and I don't apologize for having. But let's look at something as insidious and as seemingly benign as a mosquito. Mosquitoes, and I don't know how you would actually verify this, but I think it's pretty safe to think that a mosquito kills more people than many other things in life and throughout the world, throughout history, and even today. And if you're listening here in America or in Germany or Canada, you may not think about that, but mosquitoes kill a lot of people even still today. And if you're talking about a grid down scenario, man, like people are running around peeing in radiators, whatever your version of the apocalypse is, those things are likely to come back. Those pathogens. I just heard a thing my wife told me that malaria is back in Florida. Malaria is a nasty thing. Now, today we have a lot of anti-malarial drugs. And if you've ever been to an area where you had to take similar kinds of things, you'll know that that's no fun. But if you're talking about a major grid down scenario, do you have those kind of drugs, or do you have a way to prevent mosquitoes long term? Maybe you have one can of off in your preps. Is that enough? Again, mosquitoes kill many and maim many. Even if malaria is not deadly to you because you have a stronger immune system, it certainly is going to make you suboptimal. Certainly going to affect your gunfighting ability probably far more than whether you decided to go with a red dot and a magnifier or an LPVO. As much as we might debate that and forget about the lowly mosquito who might be, a more insidious killer than the guy with the AK. So there's a lot, and not just malaria, but, Zika virus and things like that, and many other pathogens that I'm probably not even aware of. And I could look up many other things, but I'm just going off kind of things that I know about from memory. Mosquitoes, they're an insidious killer. How about ticks? I can't stand ticks. One of the reasons I really don't like being east of the Mississippi or even the Missouri. It's not that there aren't mosquitoes on the West Coast, but when I was working my way back from Florida, if you don't know, my wife and I live as neo-nomads. We've kind of bugged out early, as is, I like the phrasing of that. And that came from Pastor Joe Fox of Viking Preparedness. But we bugged out early. We live large portions off-grid. We live as neo-nomads traveling around. She wanted to visit family in Florida, so we went there. And thankfully, we were able to leave there. And traveling across country, I like to go out in the woods in the wilderness. Well, I went to, I forget if it was Wisconsin or Minnesota, but I was like, oh, it's a nice day. I'm going to go out in the wilderness and go hiking. And I grew up in the South. I'm familiar with ticks, and a lot of ticks and jiggers. I have never seen anything as disgusting as far as ticks go as I saw in Wisconsin and Minnesota. My dog Alexander Hamilton and I went hiking for a couple of hours, maybe, which is not long for us. We go on pretty long hikes, so like multi-day hikes. We went hiking for a couple of hours, and I was looking down and seeing ticks. And I was looking down and seeing ticks on us. And I then started looking down, and I was able to actually find ticks just on the ground. That's disgusting. And when we got back from that short hike, even though I sprayed us down quite a bit with tick repellent, I was trying to keep track so that I could actually keep account of how many ticks we pulled off us. And I literally lost count of how many ticks we pulled off that I pulled off of each of us. He didn't pull off any ticks, but I pulled off of both of us. I mean, I was pulling them off in clusters. That is disgusting. And then I looked up, and in some places, 1 out of every 3 adult, I believe, deer ticks has Lyme disease. Now, by God's grace, I've never had Lyme disease. I also take a major course of antibiotics usually when I find myself with a tick that's been dug in for any length of time. Lyme disease is nasty. Although I have not had it, I have known several people that have had it. My little brother had it, and it's an absolutely horrible disease. Are you thinking about that in your preps? Are you thinking about maybe living somewhere that doesn't have so many of those disgusting things like ticks? And again, we may not think about that today because if we get Lyme disease, we just go to the doctor. But what if you can't? What if there aren't hospitals? Lyme disease is a nasty, nasty thing. I mean, it can even affect it affects all kinds of things. I don't want to get too far down the medical rabbit hole. I'm not a doctor, but Lyme disease is nasty. There's also Rocky Mountain fever. There's also many other, again, things that I'm probably not aware of that you might want to look into for, bloodborne pathogens via ticks. They're nasty. I can't freaking stand ticks. And I'm not a guy that shies away from wilderness and woods and things like that. And that's one thing I love about out west. I just did a several day. I've done several multi-day or long day excursions in the Bitterroot and in the Idaho-Canadian border area and all that stuff, and nothing, even if there are 1 or 2 ticks, are nothing like there are on the East Coast, and I don't know why that is, but just something to keep in mind. Those are insidious little creatures, just disgusting. Fun side note, I'm not going to get into, but if you like etymology, the where words come from, look up the word politics and see what that actually means in the Latin. I did take Latin. I do enjoy Latin, but I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole. But maybe look up politics and the etymology of politics if you want a fun thing to look into. Moving on. How about bacteria and viruses, mostly via dirty water? Again, we think a lot about guns and cool, giant, fixed-blade knives. Got to have your cool bushcrafty knife, which I like as much as probably many other survival-y people. I really enjoy that kind of stuff. I have more fixed-blade knives than probably I would ever need in any conceivable apocalypse. But historically, even in warfare, dirty water, I do believe, kills more people than knife fighting, even than gunshot wounds. Dirty water and all the things that go along with that, whether it be trench foot or gangrene or or dysentery, or all manner of other things. Dirty water is a major killer. So if you're planning on throwing on your backpack, heading for the hills, and avoiding all the zombie chipmunks or whatever you're planning, you might want more than just that life straw. And I'm a guy who spends a lot of time out in the backcountry, and I'll routinely just drink out of streams and stuff like that. But that may not be the best idea if many people have bugged out and don't know how to go to the bathroom far away from a creek or a stream and bury it. They just go to the bathroom wherever, which is not cool. But dirty water, that's a major killer. That's an insidious killer right there. So if you are actually prepping for reality and not some prepper fiction fantasy, I don't care how cool you think you look with your kit and your chest rig and your AR or your main battle rifle. And again, I like all that stuff. Your war belt. You're not going to look too cool when you're keeled over, crapping your insides out with dysentery. That's a real thing. That may not be as tactical to prep for, but it absolutely is probably a bigger danger than a GSW, than a gunshot wound. So are you prepped for that? Do you have general antibiotics? I'm talking penicillin, amoxicillin, doxycycline, 1 or 2 or all of those, or even some other ones. Major courses of antibiotics, antiviral stuff. Do you have a strong, robust immune system now? Right? Are you on top of that? Even something as mundane as a multivitamin with things like magnesium and copper and things like that, things your body needs. You may be prepping lots of calories, and I'd submit that's good. But, if you are surviving on a diet of beans and rice and wild game, more power to you. But there's probably some micronutrients in there that your body needs that you should also prep for. Do you know how to forage for vitamin C? Because it's in a lot of foods, but you have to know what those are. Things like sumac. I was just out harvesting, foraging for wild or I don't know if it's native to the area or it's invasive, but I really like sumac. In fact, I think I'm looking at some right now as I'm driving in the mobile studio. But sumac, if you know the proper kind, not the poisonous kind, proper like staghorn sumac is one, delicious, really, really good, bitter, tangy. I really like the taste, and it's crazy rich in vitamin C. Or do you know how to make like pine needle tea and things like that? Do you know how to get vitamin C? Because scurvy was a real thing. And again, I don't care how cool you look with your tactical kit. If you got scurvy, you're probably not too operational. So we like to gravitate towards the super tactical stuff, and we often forget about what actually takes people out of the fight. That's not a bullet. That's not a knife. So my goal here is not always just to tell you what you want to hear, but to speak the truth. And if this makes you a more well-rounded prepper, survivalist, whatever you want to call it, then just prepared for life, just ready for life, then, I think that's a good goal, other than just telling you what you want to hear all the time. Another thing I'd like to briefly touch on, unclean animals. If you want to know the difference between a clean and an unclean animal, I would encourage you to open up your Bible and read Leviticus chapter 11. But they are literally unclean. There are some filthy, dirty animals out there, and it's not that they're not good for anything. They're part of God's creation. They're good for many things, but they're also dangerous for many things. How about rodents? Rodents are nasty. When you live in areas with prairie dogs literally carry the bubonic plague, still today. And again, we may not think of that as a big deal because we have drugs and stuff to treat it now. But if, again, you don't have hospitals and you don't have those drugs, you probably don't want to be getting the Black Death, right? The bubonic plague, the Black Death. And there's debates on what that actually was, but it's commonly believed that what those rodents, those prairie dogs and ground squirrels and things like that carry in the Southwest and other places is the Black Death, is the bubonic plague. That's still a real thing. That still exists. That is freaking disgusting. So, yeah, rodents are gross, right? And they have fleas and things like that. And again, today we don't really think about fleas, but historically, fleas were a thing. And if modern sanitation goes away, fleas and all the things that they carry may be a thing again. Are you thinking about that? Is there anything you can do about that? Rodents carry all kinds of things. Another one, hantavirus. If you're familiar, I've been in places and operated in places where hantavirus is a thing, and hantavirus is nasty. I believe it's fatal. I may want to go look that up, but it's a nasty, nasty thing, hantavirus. So yeah, hantavirus is a thing. And that's a thing that's around right now. So that's the thing we had to be careful for today when I was doing just, let's say, stuff in the private sector. Hantavirus in really nasty environments, hantavirus is a thing. That's just another thing that rodents carry. Another real nasty one, rat lungworm. It's gross, and I think it's got a life cycle. A part of it is in a rodent, a rat, and maybe other rodents, and part of it is in another unclean animal, invertebrates, like marine invertebrates or terrestrial invertebrates like snails and shellfish, which are also unclean, again, Leviticus 11. But rat lungworm absolutely is nasty. It can get into your brain and, if not kill you, pretty much take you out of the fight. Rat lungworm is gross, and I believe that is cropping up. And it may not be cool to prep for, but yeah, rat lungworm, ugh, just a gross, nasty thing. We may not like to think about those things, and maybe that's part of the reason we don't prepare and don't prep for them. But again, if you want to be sober-minded and take the tactical goggles off, then you may want to look at those things. You may want to look at things like rat lungworm and hantavirus and the bubonic plague and how to get rid of rodents. My wife and I recently went on a rodent trapping spree. And again, we live large chunks off grid and things like that. So again, a lot of times we don't think about that because of modern sanitation, but think of what's going to happen in a city or a suburb when a giant chunk of the population, when, let's just say, the grid goes down, before a giant chunk of the population may die, and you have all the sanitation and issues that go along with that, with all the insects and rodents that are eating and breeding and multiplying. Just think about the grid going down and all the sanitation. You, hopefully, if you're a prepper, know where to go to the bathroom if you don't have running water, if you can't just use the toilet. What do? Many people won't know what to do, and they'll go to the bathroom wherever. And think about if you're living in an area where people just go to the bathroom wherever. Right? I've been to third world countries. I've been to failed states and broken societies. Look at the sanitation there. Yeah. Right? So think about that. And not to mention phase 2, if the grid does go down, how many people are going to die? That's a debated thing. I've heard all kinds of different figures. But that doesn't just affect, you might think you can live just fine without electricity and stuff, but you got to think about that will affect gasoline, and that will affect goods being shipped in and out. If you don't produce your own food, and most people don't, what does that lead to? Famine, right? If you're talking about big chunks of the population going away, what happens to all those people? And what happens to those unclean, nasty things like the insects and the larvae and the rodents that feed on carrion, dead things, and sadly, people, right? What happens not only to them, but the secondary and tertiary effects of that when that becomes the environment? Do you really want to be in a people hive when the peanut butter and chocolate hits the fan? Not just for the people behaving badly, but also for the sanitation. Think about that. It'd be one thing if you're, again, on the, Canadian-Idaho border where the population density is like 2 per square mile. Literally, I looked it up, one of the last places that we were sojourning in. I like that word, sojourner. maybe I'll start using sojourner instead of neo-nomad. Sojourner is a good word. Anyway, you're kind of inside my brain right now, but sojourner is a good word. One of the last places we were sojourning, and I looked up the population density in the county we were in, and it was 2. I looked up the population density when I was in Central Florida, and the entire state of Florida, and big chunks of that are not really inhabited like the Everglades, but the population density of Florida, the state as a whole, was over 400 people per square mile. Think about the sanitation in those 2 environments. The environment can probably sustain sanitation for 2 people per square mile. So square mile is a big area. Think about 400 and some people per square mile. I doubt the environment's going to handle that too well when the grid goes down. So just some sober, maybe not super fun, but very practical mental exercises to think about. As cool as the next new fighting handgun is, and I love fighting handguns. I do a whole other podcast called Gunfighter Life. I like fighting handguns. I do. But, if you already have a good fighting handgun, are you better off spending $500 on... $500 would be a cheap handgun. Are you better spending $1,000 on another fighting handgun? Or maybe spending far less than that on some good general purpose antibiotics? Yeah. So anyway, just some thoughts about real killers, real insidious killers. Maybe something like that will be the title. Anyway, just some thoughts I thought I'd share with you. I appreciate you listening. I am humbled and blessed that you listen. I'm not telling you where to get antibiotics, but I'm telling you it's not that hard to get antibiotics. Tactical tip of the day, look into what antibiotics might work well for a variety of things. One that comes to my mind is doxycycline. I'm not telling you to take doxycycline. That's probably against some kind of law, but doxycycline is a good general purpose antibiotic. You might look into that, and you might write down, this is your tactical tip, whatever your bottle of antibiotics is for your fish or whatever actual application, you may write down the common dosage that you might get from like WebMD or something. You might write down that dose on the actual bottle. So if the grid goes down, you might write down for such and such a condition, you take this much antibiotics for this many days on the actual bottle. That way, if you have the bottle of antibiotics, you have the course that you should take for most common things like Lyme disease or many other things. Anyway, that's your tactical tip of the day, your tactical verse of the day. And forgive me, I am in the mobile studio, and this is not one of the ones I have committed to memory, but we're called to judge soberly. And go look up, if you just Google judge soberly verse, it'll probably come up with the actual verse, but we're called to judge soberly. And one of the actual verses that comes to mind that I do know is, you shall do no injustice in judgment in measurements of length, weight, or volume. You shall have honest scales, honest weights, an honest ephah, and an honest hin. Be honest in your dealings, and be sober in your judgment, men. With that, thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.